Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientists monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, President and CEO of the Foundation, and your host and moderator for today's webinar. Today, Dr. Herbert Meltzer will present John Forbes Nash Jr., A Beautiful Mind, Schizophrenia, Game Theory, and Recovery from Schizophrenia with and Without Medication. The Brain and Behavior Research Foundation is committed to alleviating the suffering caused by mental illness by awarding grants that will lead to advances and breakthroughs in scientific research. The Foundation is the largest private funder of mental health research grants. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded more than $360 million to fund more than 5,000 grants to more than 4,000 scientists around the world. 100% of all donor contributions for research are invested in our grants to scientists who are working to find breakthroughs in disorders such as ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, OCD, PTSD, addiction, and schizophrenia. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Herbert Meltzer. Dr. Meltzer is Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and of Physiology at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. Dr. Meltzer directs research into medication development and is known worldwide for his work to develop the use of clozapine for the treatment of schizophrenia. Dr. Meltzer is also a founding member of the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Scientific Council. He's a recipient of the 1992 Lieber Prize for Outstanding Achievement in Schizophrenia Research and a four-time Foundation grantee. Today's webinar will begin with Dr. Meltzer's presentation. This will be followed by a question and answer period. To submit your questions, please use the Questions tab on the control panel of your screen. Feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation, and I will present your questions to Dr. Meltzer and will address as many as possible in the time allotted. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Herbert Meltzer. Herb, the floor is yours.
Jeff, thank you very much for this opportunity. I've been very grateful to Brain Behavior Foundation for all the opportunities it's provided me and many of my colleagues. And I hope today's program will prove of interest to the audience. I got interested in John Nash when, like many in the audience, the news of his winning the Nobel Prize in economics was published, and the story of his schizophrenia. And having a long-standing interest in both economics and schizophrenia, I was eager to make contact with him and was fortunately able to do that. I became his friend, I think, and a member of the family, a friend of the family over the years. So I wanted to be clear from the beginning that I was never his doctor, but this presentation comes out of our personal relationship and my interest in the truly exceptional story about schizophrenia that he represents. I wanted to mention some of the sources of the research support that I've had over the years, including, as you've heard, the Brain Behavior Research Foundation, but also NIMH, and from a number of pharmaceutical companies, some of whose drugs I'll mention during the course of this talk, and a number of donors, some of whom have come from the Brain Behavior Research Foundation, extended family. I'll mention a bit about this drug Nuplazid, which is the first real, I think, novel treatment for schizophrenia, eventually for schizophrenia, we'll see, that has come along in the last 60 years since the discovery of Thorazine. And I happen to be one of the discoverers of it, and an investor in it from the early days, so I thought it important to mention that relationship. And then there are some of these other companies that I've worked with whose drugs I thought would be useful to bring into our conversation today. This is a picture of the real John Nash and his wife Alicia on the left, and my wife Sharon next to her, between John and Alicia and myself. You know, as I was looking this over a moment ago, I'm not so sure it was at the filming, at the time of the screening of A Beautiful Mind at Vanderbilt, when the Nashes spent 3 or 4 days with us in the Nashville community, or it could have been at a fundraiser for NARSET called Sunshine and Darkness in Sarasota that the wonderful Peterson family sponsored years ago that I spoke regularly at. Regardless, it captures, I think, the warm relationships among the 4 of us. And I know that were he still with us, he would be supportive of what I'm doing. I will mention that one of the things I'm going to talk about, I've really waited until he was gone, if that would be the way it would occur, to talk about. And I'll explain that as I go along. In fact, what you see on this next slide is a title of a paper that I first started to write in 1986 when I moved from Case Western to Vanderbilt and was asked to give a public lecture. And I decided the story of Nash and schizophrenia would be an excellent basis for that. And as I got deep into reading his work and understanding his significance, I came across an idea, which will be one of the last things I will talk about him today, that I addressed with him in some ways while he was still alive, but because of its very nature, decided that it would be better to publish it at some later date. And this is coming out in this paper, which will be in a special issue of the journal Games and Economic Behavior, which has many personal accounts of all the others are economists, and then there's me, of their relationship with Nash. The book is, the issue will be in press or fully available within a few months, but Dr. Kali informed me that an extensive excerpts of the book, including from my paper, are now online, which I think you could find if you Google Kali and Nash and the journal's name. But so, again, what I'm talking about today, my own views of this are covered in some more detail in that paper. So this next slide is to just give us a global picture of this extraordinary man who unfortunately was taken from us along with Alicia in an automobile accident in May 2015. He was born in West Virginia in a family with no mental illness. His extraordinary intellect was evident throughout his early schooling. He got a full scholarship to study. First became chemistry, but then he migrated to mathematics very quickly and graduated Carnegie Mellon at age 19 and got a scholarship to study math at Princeton, which was one of the top math programs, if not the top one in the country. And in 2 years, he got his PhD and, in fact, wrote the papers, 2 papers as a graduate student that was eventually the basis for his Nobel Prize. When he got to Princeton, the leading intellectuals, not only at Princeton, but certainly in the American intelligentsia, worldwide intelligentsia, were John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern, who had developed the original game theory. And you might say that John Nash was really full of himself. He was quite sure he could do better work than they had done, and in fact, he was able to achieve that. I think some of that came out in the film A Beautiful Mind. And but it was recognized, the importance of his work was recognized immediately in the field, but the incubation period for the award of the Nobel Prize was extended for 3 to 4 decades because of his mental illness, and we'll get into that. He finally was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1994 in economic sciences, with 2 other people who followed him in the field of game theory, Reinhard Selten and John Harsanyi, whose work was certainly dependent upon the advances that John Nash had made. Beyond his the game theory contributions for the economics and the social sciences that I'll go, what people need to know is he was an extraordinary mathematician, and he published 3 papers in the Annals of Mathematics. If you publish only 1 paper in that journal in your lifetime, it's almost the equivalent of the Nobel Prize. And he did 3, 2 before he got grossly ill, and then 1 was in the midst. He was in the midst of when he got ill, and was finished with the aid of one of his colleagues, or one or more of his colleagues at Harvard, who I happened to meet almost accidentally, who told me the story of how the 3rd paper was done. Now, I think these quotes from Roger Myerson, a former colleague at Northwestern, now at the University of Chicago, another Nobel laureate in game theory who I discussed John Nash with, really epitomize just how exceptional he is. Let me read that, and you can as well. Nash's contribution to economics constitutes the most important breakthrough in the history of social sciences. His contribution had a pervasive impact in economics and the social sciences, which is comparable to that of the discovery of the DNA double helix in the biological sciences. I was taught by James Watson when I did chemistry as a graduate student before I went to medical school. I have known at least a half a dozen Nobel laureates quite well. And I can say unequivocally that of all of them, the intellect, and this is even after his illness, of all of them that I was most impressed with for various reasons, was John Nash. And that had to do with his incredible ability to, as I saw it in our relationship, to understand my logic, where arguments were going, where discussions were going, and to be at least 6 steps ahead of me at all times. And it proved interesting and frustrating because it was not possible to get any answer out of him to a question he didn't want to discuss. But it was an extraordinary experience to spend the long days with him in various occasions. Something I truly treasure. So this is a picture provided to me by a member of his family of his actual Nobel Prize, and certainly a fitting reward. Right before his death, he got an almost equally prestigious award, the Abel Prize, from the Finnish government. So the world truly did recognize what this person with schizophrenia had produced. One of the things I noted in the paper was the striking correspondence between him and Vasiliev Nijinsky. I have a great passion for ballet, and the fascinating story about Nijinsky that parallels Nash, Nijinsky being the greatest dancer, male dancer of the earliest 20th century, some people say of all time, was that around the same age that Nash became floridly psychotic, Nijinsky became psychotic, never recovered, spent the rest of his days institutionalized, wrote an exceptional biography, and while hospitalized, that really is a classic example of the thinking of someone with schizophrenia. And that between the two of them, it puts in perspective the notion that even though you have the genes for schizophrenia, whether we're talking about intellectual accomplishment or the artistry and motor movements, and schizophrenia is a disorder which does affect the skeletal muscle system as well as the brain, that it does not prevent you from potentially and actually achieving some extraordinary things. And I'll go into my theory as to why it was possible for Nash to at least achieve part of his potential. One can only speculate what would have happened if his illness had somehow been prevented from expressing itself to even later or ever. And I don't believe it's pie in the sky that we'll get to that point in coming decades, not centuries, through further research of the type that's sponsored by the BBRF and NIMH and other groups. So let me now go through a little bit more of the history of Nash beyond that global summary. He was doing fine until the late 1950s. He graduated Princeton, got an assistant professorship at Harvard in mathematics. It was an era that he was very frustrated because he truly longed to get the Fields Prize. I think if you asked him which of these two prizes he would have preferred, the Field or the Nobel, there wouldn't be any question that it was the Fields Prize, the one that goes to the great mathematicians of the world. And he certainly deserved it, in my view, and in the mathematicians I've spoken to about him, he deserved it. It was one of those accidents of other people doing some work that apparently led them not to give it to either him or somebody else who did something similar at the same time. I bring this up because he was a very sensitive human being, and and that was coupled with his intense ambition to achieve and to be recognized for his achievement. And the frustration of not getting all the recognition he felt was his due would fit into this pattern of stress, which to me, and this is part of my current research now, I've become extraordinarily impressed with the interaction between stress, and I'm using that in the lay terms as we all do it, although I operationalize it in research, that how that fits in with abnormal chemistry in the brain and structure and function in the brain to exacerbate problems and make it enormously more difficult for the current treatments that we have to operate. So, but I'm diverting here. The point I want to make was that he was doing fine until some of the stress around his academic advancement, and then getting married and Alicia becoming pregnant with their first child, I was thinking this morning about how first trimester events and stress for women are well known to be risk factors for schizophrenia. Well, it also is true, can be true for the father, and it's from what I've read and what he told me, that was he wasn't quite prepared for that. What also had happened to Nash was he had had a relationship with another woman before he met Alicia. All this is fully described in the book, but not in the film, which took liberties with this aspect of his life. And he had another son, John Charles Steer, from prior to the relationship with Alicia. And that weighed on him, too, I'm sure, fitting in with the stress of John Charles being born at that same time. So as her pregnancy advanced, as John Charles was born, the first florid psychosis emerged. Now, I will be spending a fair amount of time of what I believe might have been happening to him, as it happens with other people with schizophrenia, in the years before the florid psychosis, the so-called prodromal period. But once the dam broke, so to speak, once the positive symptoms, the delusions and hallucinations emerged, they proved extremely hard to treat. He was treated at McLean Hospital, one of our leading psychiatric hospitals. Those psychiatric records are sealed. I've never had a chance to read them. Very little that we know about his response, but one can infer that John Forbes Nash was probably what I call treatment-resistant schizophrenia, the type of schizophrenia that led me to spend decades working on clozapine and other drugs to treat the people whose psychosis does not respond to the first-generation antipsychotic drugs of that era, drugs like haloperidol and thorazine, and indeed many of them don't even respond to the newer atypical drugs, which I'll explain. So what happened was that Nash would probably have had only minimal control of his positive symptoms. He had numerous hospitalizations over that first decade. He'd get himself together sufficiently to be discharged, but that was the era that I was a resident in Boston at the Mass Mental Health Center. Someone who stayed in a state hospital, in his case it was also in New Jersey after McLean, meant that that person had really moderate to severe symptoms that people felt needed to be institutionalized to deal with. So despite insulin coma and ECT, and I could also, mention here how he rejected the idea that medications were the way to deal with his symptoms, probably because they weren't really working very well. But ironically, as you'll see, it became the basis for my relationship with him. So after a decade of a really very poor response to the available treatments, and I'm sure at McLean and the other hospitals he had the full range of psychosocial treatments that were available at the time. Alicia was unable to cope with this. They divorced, but she remained his caretaker outside the hospital. He was unable to ever recover sufficiently to get another academic position, and he became a street person almost. In Princeton, with Alicia, though divorced, providing a home for him and caring for him as best she could. It was took until 1980ish or so before he improved enough for him to be potentially considered for the Nobel Prize. So let me go into that. So what happened was in 1994, he gets the prize, and I read about this. And I wrote to one of his colleagues at Princeton, who I didn't know. I just said I was someone who had some expertise in treating schizophrenia, this drug clozapine, which helped a lot of people who hadn't been helped by other treatments. I didn't know if Nash had clozapine, which he hadn't. And would he put me in touch with Nash? And Nash read my email or letter, I still have it, and said, yes, I'd like to meet you, and invited me to come down to Princeton. But he made it very clear that the main purpose of our meeting was to talk about his son and his own difficulty responding to treatment. So briefly, his son, the second son, was another brilliant mathematician, but who also developed schizophrenia at about the same age. And he wanted my help in possibly helping John, which I tried to do. So I'll go through that, talk some more about drug treatments for schizophrenia, and some of our current theories about how we can use genetics to better treat schizophrenia, and another exceptional case of schizophrenia that I had, where we went back to. How did we do that? We'll be able to just go. Hold on. Here we go. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I've described the family, the reasons for my relationship to John Steer, who is the son before his marriage to Alicia, and that the basis of Nash wanting to see me turned out to be also, as I understood it, how he controlled his symptoms, his desire to have Johnny have the same ability to recover that he had. And what he told me, and I want to read some of his own words about this, that he said in a number of different ways that he had been able to control his psychosis through an act of will almost, not attending to the voices that he was constantly hearing, because he realized he would not be able to help Johnny or himself, couldn't contribute to the economics of the family until if he continued to believe, as he did believe, in some of the thoughts that he described as being transported into his mind. And he hoped that if Johnny could see him doing this, that would be a model that would enable Johnny to do the same. One particular quote, ultimately I began rejecting the voices and deciding not to listen, and of course my son had been hearing voices, and if he can progress to the state of rejecting them, then he can come out of his mental illness. And he did it sufficiently to win the Nobel Prize, which had a considerable amount of money associated with it. He became a very frequent lecturer, earning considerable, for that family, amounts of honoraria to help them provide better for themselves. It's why he was interested to work with the film I had quite some time helping him to get through some of his concerns, to be on 60 Minutes. He was really quite a bit agitated about some of the things he thought might come out on that. But he was able to do it. Meanwhile, the medication advice from me and others, I was never Johnny's doctor, never really helped Johnny very well. Johnny was an extraordinarily sick individual. When I met with him, and from the original time on, it was quite a difficult time to engage in any kind of rational discussion with his son. And that created, that was really when Nash was at Vanderbilt for a week and so on. The main issues that were constantly requiring my efforts were to make sure he was, that Johnny and John Nash's attitude to Johnny was such that he could function well in the various lectures and things that he did there. So I'll be happy to answer some more questions about Nash personally, but I wanted to now move on to this idea that I got as I began to read the two key papers that Nash had wrote when he was 19 years old. And one of the things that struck me in the classic, this is not the most important of the two papers, the bargaining problem paper, but he wrote this sentence which really struck me. In general terms, we idealize the bargaining problem by assuming that the two individuals are highly rational and each can accurately compare his desires for various things, are equal in bargaining skills, and that each has full knowledge of the tastes and preferences of the other. So I read that last clause over and over again, trying to think, what did he mean by that? He never offered an explanation. There are commentaries on it in the game theory literature, and his colleagues were often uncomfortable with the concept, and they changed it to the word common knowledge. So I took it in the literal sense for various reasons. The chief one being that it was, to me, it resonated with the concept of Kurt Schneider. Why did that happen? I didn't touch anything, and it just okay. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Possible, so Kurt Schneider was one of the leading theoreticians of the 20th century about schizophrenia. And the first-rank symptoms were the ideas that thoughts, that people with schizophrenia and eventually through bipolar could have thoughts inserted into their mind. They could be broadcast from one person's mind to another. Thoughts could diffuse from one person's mind to the other. They were, that would be, as I saw it, one possible way to achieve full knowledge if you're in a two-person or a multi-person game theory. And it fitted in with his statements that he was constantly having these telephone calls into his head from various people. And I wondered if somehow that idea made it possible for him to translate into very complicated mathematical terms. This, which is what won the prize. It wasn't simply the idea of full knowledge. It was, he was able to put into a series of equations the way a game could play out if people had this full knowledge. I thought that if it occurred in someone without schizophrenia, they'd be more likely to reject it, as perhaps it had occurred to Morgenstern and von Neumann, but he was, I thought, comfortable with that. So that's the idea that he and I danced around as we discussed, and it's impossible for me to say whether he validated it or not. I never got a clear-cut rejection of it. I'll put it at that. So we can come back to that. Let me now kind of close, got 10 or 15 minutes, with some of the current information. Well, the last point about that I should have made clear was during the prodromal period from, remember he got grossly psychotic in 1959. It could well have been between the thesis and 59 when he would be having prodromal periods where he'd have these ideas. And intervening during the prodrome and to prevent the onset of psychosis has become a major goal of much of the research that's going on in schizophrenia. So now let me just talk a little bit about current treatment. There are two main classes of antipsychotic drugs. The atypical ones, a term that came about because clozapine did not typically produce the Parkinsonism associated with the first generation typical antipsychotic drugs. In let me see when I published that. I think it was 1979 or 80, or somewhere in the 80s. I published what I thought was the basis for a clozapine special, Pharmacology and Clinical Features, this so-called serotonin dopamine hypothesis, and ultimately expanded that to show that multiple features of the serotonin and dopamine system could make for a more effective and antipsychotic, which could also accomplish the crucial task of improving cognition in schizophrenia. And this is the work that I'm still engaged on. We also showed that clozapine, and this has been validated many times, could reduce the risk for schizophrenia, and that has been recognized in FDA and American Psychiatric Association guidelines. Meanwhile, we've learned an enormous amount that has taken us beyond the classical idea that all schizophrenia and all psychosis was related to excessive dopamine. And we've been able to identify drugs with other pharmacologic features that are now the targets for drug discovery. Pimavanserin or Nuplazid, as I mentioned in the beginning, that I helped discover and develop, is the first antipsychotic that doesn't require the dopamine receptor blockade. And I'll talk a little bit about it. My concern that dopamine receptor blockade, to any extent, over a long period of time, can have some adverse effects on cognition. Nuplazid right now is approved only for the use of psychosis in Parkinson's disease, and studies are underway to see if it can be helpful in Alzheimer's disease and schizophrenia. Cariprazine is a new antipsychotic that emphasizes a different kind of dopamine receptor, the D3 receptor, and it is too soon to say how more broadly it will be useful. Would be useful in treatment-resistant patients or for cognition. That's work yet to be done. But I bring it up in the context that out of the serotonin dopamine hypothesis that I published came the classic drugs that most people use now, olanzapine, risperidone, lurasidone, etc. And cariprazine does not have that strong serotonin receptor blockade. The other big thing that I have been working on is to find genetic biomarkers for schizophrenia. There have been extraordinary advances in the genetics of schizophrenia. We know that well over 100, some people think it's already 500, going to 1,000, different genes of small effect produce the picture of what we call schizophrenia. It's a very diverse syndrome. And some of those risk genes, but other genes not associated with the disease per se, that is, they're not more common in people with schizophrenia than they are in the general population, but they nevertheless influence the chemistry of the brain in such a way as to affect drug response, the particular picture. And these are now being identified. That's one of the three major projects I'm engaged in. We think we have the genetic signature to predict the response to at least one of the widely used antipsychotic drugs, and looking forward to publishing that and having it replicated. We have new samples to do the replication, and if they replicate, that work will become a prototype for how you could use a blood sample, a saliva sample, to identify which drug would be best, having minimal side effects. Last human stuff I want to talk about was an extraordinary patient I treated in Vanderbilt who, after 30 years of illness, got into one of our studies. She was the most floridly psychotic, most treatment-resistant of anyone in the study. And strangely, after 6 months of treatment in this study, she had an extraordinary recovery. It began first with her cognition, which was almost untestable when we began, and over a 6 to 26-week period that almost normalized, essentially did normalize, with her test scores all being within a normal range. And then overnight, her psychosis, which had been totally disruptive in the same ways Nash's had been, that disappeared overnight. We thought it was due to synchronization of various rhythms in her brain that happens during sleep. And we're on the verge of converting her white blood cells into stem cells to be able to get much more further into the chemistry. My hope is that we will understand better why this happened. The key thing about this woman, beyond the symptoms I'm describing and the cognition, was that we actually saw major changes in the gray and white matter of her brain. They came back. The brain, despite all these years of illness, failed treatments, something happened to that individual in our treatment regimen, whatever, that enabled her to recover. And this is part of the current focus in so much of neuroscience research on the plasticity of the brain, from the cellular level to the gross level. What we saw in her was at the gross level. We could see this. 2 different world-class brain imaging groups have verified this. So I think it's a tremendous measure or message of potential hope down the way, that even some of the most difficult cases can respond. And that's what I show here. What was interesting about her, too, the early features of her illness had many more mood symptoms, but in the last decade, it was pure phenotype of schizophrenia diagnosed by many of my colleagues before she was finally sent to us. I have a minute or two to, I was going to show you a little bit of our animal studies where we do this, and basically without going into the details of the experiment, we can prevent the development of cognitive impairment that's in mouse and monkeys and rats with the current generation of atypical antipsychotic drugs. However, the way we did it, this is a proof of concept, once we stopped the treatment, the symptoms that would have emerged if we hadn't given a treatment appeared for the first time. In other words, we could extend the prodromal period, and whether we can do this indefinitely, whether we can do this in man, this is the kind of thing that research in the future will uncover, and that the BBRF is certainly sponsoring. So let me conclude here. We had this case of John Nash, who, even among the world, the universe of Nobel Prize winners, stands out in my mind and mind of people like Myerson as a truly exceptional genius. That he had a genetically determined version of this, I think you can conclude from the fact that his son had such a similar cause. Was there a relationship between mathematics and madness here? We don't know. We do know that many people with who are great mathematicians, from Newton and Gödel and others, have had psychosis and depression and suicide. From Nash himself and from the story I just told you, we can see that even in one case, Nash's case, without medication, using something like a self-cognitive behavioral therapy, he was able to control his psychosis. In the second case that I described briefly, it was medication that enabled the chemistry of her brain to get restored. And so I remain optimistic that through combined efforts of society, family, medical research, the scourge of schizophrenia can be brought under control. So let me stop at this point and leave some time for some questions.
Thank you very, very much, Herb, for just an outstanding presentation and sharing the personal aspect as well as the scientific is just a great combination. A number of questions have come forward about the cognitive symptoms, and in particular from people who are parents who are concerned about their child who may have already a diagnosis of schizophrenia or maybe in that prodromal phase. And I'd like to speak a little bit more about what should a parent do if they want to make sure that their child reaches their best potential.
Right. Well, one of the points I was saying that we learned from Nash was a long prodrome before the psychosis actually emerges. Having that child, young adolescent, be able to get through high school, college, first periods before they actually become psychotic is extremely valuable in and of itself. I mentioned the stress issue, so I've become extraordinarily sensitive to the issue of helping people, and in our laboratory equivalent, cope with stress to delay the time of onset. The medication issue is extraordinarily difficult at this time. The approach of all the leaders in treating people in the prodrome, and it's very understandable why, is to use the kinds of medications, not so much clozapine, but the other serotonin, dopamine antagonists, and to use them in very low doses. And the reasons why they do that is to minimize the side effects, which are very intolerable to young people, especially the sedation, weight gain, and that. Well, it turns out in our animal models of prodromal research, where we have been able to delay the onset of the psychosis, using drugs like phencyclidine, PCP, or genetic changes to induce eventual schizophrenia-like behaviors, it turns out these medications work, but they require very high doses. And what we're trying to do is get at the essence of the chemistry that will enable to give doses that are tolerable. So what is my message to the family? Well, for sure, get good neurocognitive testing. This is a thing that's not widely done. It's expensive for some reason. It shouldn't be that, but it is. But we need the baseline of working memory, long-term memory, executive function, etc. And we need to follow the trajectory of that. Because that cognitive impairment that the families are worried about is happening even before the psychosis emerges. So my message to them is to track that and to be focusing the treatment on that at least as much as the positive symptoms, illusions, hallucinations. And the last point of that, and this is, I wished I had more time of it, John Nash was practicing a kind of cognitive behavioral therapy, or sometimes called cognitive emotive therapy. And this is still in its infancy, but it's getting there. There are ways probably to help the neuroplasticity using non-medication approaches. I can't point you to any data in the literature that's going to say if you apply that in the prodromal period, it's going to delay or prevent it. But rationally, it makes some sense to me. And I think a combination of medications that are tolerable plus that kind of therapy and stress reduction is the best that we have to offer at the moment.
Well, I think that's very good advice, and the point about delaying the onset of significant symptoms is very, very important in the course of the life of the person. And also, as you know, and many people in the audience know, often even once a person has a first break, has clear psychosis, there's a delay in actually having appropriate treatment, which is obviously important as well. A number of people were asking you about the newer medications that are available, and obviously you clearly stated that it's now been made available for Parkinson's disease. What's the time frame and what's your perspective in terms of some of the newer medications for schizophrenia?
Well, they're all, what we have now are drugs built on the serotonin dopamine model. The most recent of them that's been fairly widely adopted is lurasidone or Latuda. There's no good, well, yeah, let me put it this way. I tried to, in the brief time I had, to say that these drugs in the second generation drugs, or I call them atypical, are more than just 5-H serotonin dopamine blockers. They have exceptional effects to release acetylcholine, dopamine, etc., because of effects that they don't all share on, I won't get too technical, on different serotonin and dopamine receptors and that. So it's my view now that it does make sense after a trial of 6 weeks to 6 months to switch from one atypical to another. Much too often what's going on out there is rapid switching. It's not possible to get a fair trial in a matter of 2 to 4 weeks. Having said that, now I brought out cariprazine simply because it's a drug with a significant deviation from the pattern of the other drugs, and so rather than try a drug 2, 3, and 4 of the serotonin dopamine class, one might try cariprazine. I can't go into it today, but I have a view that clozapine is not so special for treatment-resistant schizophrenia, that if you intelligently use some of the other atypicals, they can be used for treatment-resistant schizophrenia, but people should be discussing that view. Clearly, clozapine is underutilized. Certainly when a suicide, there is nothing like clozapine for suicide, so that should be done. Now, the Nuplazid drug, because of my own personal involvement in it, I can't say too much more about where to go. I know that I can simply say that the company is engaging within the next month. They'll be starting their first trials on schizophrenia, and we'll have to see how they work. Having said that, I did publish a study 4 or 5 years ago showing how that drug could be used with the drug risperidone to dramatically enhance the onset of action of risperidone and reduce the side effects. But that is not FDA approved as an indication. But I'm hopeful that there'll be research on that way with Nuplazid. Now, there are other drugs like it that are in development. They're selective. The thing about, I do want to make this, I've got a few minutes more. John Nash wrote that he thought antipsychotic drugs could be harmful to his cognition. And Herb Meltzer has written the same thing. And let me explain. D2 receptor blockades can cause tardive dyskinesia. They can damage the basal ganglia. And drugs, and the old-fashioned drugs, Haldol, Thorazine, that's all that they do. They block D2 blocks. So the beauty of the serotonin dopamine drugs and the newer ones is that they really minimize the amount of D2 receptor blockade. And in the case of Nuplazid, they completely get away from it for the first time. You can treat psychosis without any D2 receptor blockade. And we need to go along those lines. So I think on a preventive mode, use of an atypical antipsychotic drug, avoiding just a D2 receptor blockade drug like Haldol whenever possible, and it's almost always possible, is a way to possibly improve things. Now, there are experimental drugs coming along that have different mechanisms of action, but this is where BBRF support comes in, and industry and government. The more money we could put in. This has been a very difficult era for schizophrenia research. The NIH in general, money was not available for clinical research and the like. People probably saw the article in the New York Times. We have too much neuroscience research, etc. Well, we haven't had enough, and we really need a lot more. And the more we support that kind of approach, the quicker the kinds of help the families are looking for will be available.
Well, Herb, your timing was perfect in terms of this presentation. A tremendous amount of information, and I want to thank you on behalf of BBRF and our board and our scientists, and most importantly, the families and the people who have benefited from the work that you've done, that have helped so many people around the world. And I want to thank you for what you have done, and also thank you for what you're continuing to do to improve the lives of people who have these illnesses. So thank you so very, very much.
Thank you, Jeff.
I want to also thank everybody who joined us for today's webinar. The webinar is recorded, so if you missed any portion of it or would like to share it with a family member or friend, please visit the webinar page on our website. All of the research that we fund is made possible through private donations. So if you'd like to make a gift, please visit our website, bbrfoundation.org, or call 1-800-829-8289. Finally, I hope that you'll all join us again next month when Dr. Robert Friedman, professor and chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and a member of our scientific council, will present a webinar entitled, "Could we someday prevent schizophrenia like we prevent cleft palate?" This will take place on Tuesday, November 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Once again, thank you and enjoy the rest of the day. Take care.